Hi, everybody. Welcome. We have a fabulous interview coming up today with Johann Calleman. And this is something that has really not been looked into very much in the whole story of the year of the great COVID pandemic. And that is the underlying consciousness that allows for something like this in all its dimensions and all its effects on humanity to take place. And I think that that is the overarching and most important story because it's leading us to something better in the end. But we've got a lot to trip through between now and then. So let's go to Carl. Carl, thank you so much. I haven't seen you for a couple years since we were on the Gaia set together, and we're going to be doing that again. We're doing this interview and we're going to continue the conversation a little later this summer in the Gaia studios. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be back with you. And I think it's great if we can continue because there are many aspects of this to cover.
Yes, yeah. You said we need more than an hour. I totally agree. So we're going to do that because your work has a lot of depth to it. And a lot of people covered 2012 and the Mayan calendar and had their various spins on it. But you've spent the last 20 years of your life after a career in the laboratory, basically, right?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Very much so. Mm-hmm.
And that might also, because you have a background in a PhD in the physical sciences and biology, it might also, we might even coax you into talking a little bit about your perception about what this notion of the virus is or isn't beyond the waves of consciousness, okay? We'll see if we get to that in this interview. If not, we'll get to it at Gaia, okay?
Great.
Okay, good. So first of all, your background is in understanding on very deep levels the Mayan calendar. And your latest book, which is the 9 Waves of Creation, has to do with cycles and waves of consciousness. And we're in a very interesting one right now that I find is overlaying with Vedic astrology, Western astrology, Hermeticism. It doesn't really matter what take you get. You're looking at a similar pattern on the curve. So let's start out in talking about the precision of the mathematics that you so love as a scientist that the Mayan calendar brings to us.
Yeah. So, you know, I think there is many of the aspects that people have come to know about the Mayan calendar and the Mayan worldview in ancient times really were shared all over the world in ancient times. You know, just to give 2 examples, all over the world people talk about the tree of life. And you might say all over the world people talk about serpents as creator gods. So that's ancient philosophy, you might say. But there is one reason that has attracted me to the Maya and to devote so much studies to them, and that is the fact that they described in mathematical terms what they saw as the evolution of the universe. And suddenly then when you have numbers, you have something different. You have an inroad to what you would call science. And if you then start to look at how they study these waves in their calendars, you can look at these precise movement in times, and then you can ask yourself, does this really fit into what we from a modern perspective would look upon as the evolution of the universe? And that's what I have found and developed in a series of books. And that's also then why, you know, first people might wonder, why study the Maya? You know, it's the people, or maybe 10 million people or something like that. But there are 2 reasons. One is that it's sort of the highest intellectual level of any Native American culture. It was sort of like the Greek used to be the highest of Europe. The Maya were the same for the Americas. And the second reason is exactly that they provide numbers. And that means that it's not just a philosophy, but something we can test, something we can, it provides a scientific level of our understanding.
Yes, and so when we're talking about it in the context of today's conversation, you're referring to it as this kind of serpentine sine wave type of energy that indicates large cycles of time, or Baktuns, in the Mayan cosmology. And you have graphs in your documents and in your books that show where certain civilizations have risen and where they have fallen according to the sine wave in these Baktuns. But each of these waves, it sounds like, is giving order to a potential for a certain type of consciousness to be expressed at that time in history. And then we also have choices as to how we're going to engage with it, right?
I would say so. And that's, what I look upon the Mayan heritage is like an embryo to a quantum theory, in contrast to the other astrological systems of the world, which is really based on Newtonian physics, if you want to make that distinction. And that's very important, the quantum aspect, because that means that things are not determined by the quantum state, the cosmic quantum states that inform our minds and so forth. We may not be able to avoid being informed by these quantum states, but it's not determined. We do have a choice, and that's always been something that's been pointed out as a characteristic of quantum science, in contrast to Newtonian science and the kind of astrologies that have been developed around those.
Yes, and the reason I wanted to talk to you about this today is because I've literally been going through a little bit of an existential crisis myself. Normally, I'm clear-headed. You know, I feel I can perceive into energies. That's my thing, is to perceive into energies, even if it takes a while to sort it through a little bit more logically. And I was noticing that the streams of behavior and information that are occurring right now are totally incoherent with what I'm perceiving. And so it puts you at odds with people. It can put you at odds with everybody, and sometimes even yourself, saying, what's going on? Well, this is what we're going to work toward in this conversation, because one thing that really intrigued me about your article, and the reason I reached out and said, let's do this thing now, Carl, is that it touches into where on that wave of consciousness mistrust and paranoia start seeping into civilizations to create a collective conspiratorial mindset, which becomes the end of a culture or civilization. It leads to its downfall. We're there now. In my opinion, we're there now. We're at that point. We can determine where we're going to go. So we're going to work our way toward that. But that's why I feel this conversation is so important, is this cognitive dissonance that's happening from every angle. First of all, tell me, just to reflect on that, your perception of what you see going on out there, what you're experiencing.
Yeah, I think I can relate to that. Well, first of all, my background in this is really that there are several different waves, 9 different waves to be precise. And sometimes those waves, and this has only been the case since 2011. In other words, there is this inscription from the Maya, from ancient times, saying that at that point in time, all the 9 waves will be available. First time in history, and to some extent they have opposing effects. And so I think I can relate to what you're saying. It's hard to navigate the world in a new way. And I've had, politically speaking, I've had a sort of little bit of a left-leaning direction in my views, but that doesn't, it doesn't work for me just to apply that to the current situation and have my already preset ideas about this should be that or something like that, because now I find myself at odds sometimes with both sides. And what that means is that it really is a challenge to have your have your own navigation, have your own compass, and it's not what it used to be. I hope that speaks to what's the same thing, right?
It's exactly what I'm saying. And what I just heard you say prior to this is, for the first time, we're having access to all 9 waves of the potential of each level of consciousness. But we are, and we're going to get to this toward the end of the interview and reinforce it later in the Gaia interview, but it's all leading toward an amazing opportunity. And I personally have been tapped into that opportunity. The opportunity of the times for so many years, feeling this coming, that I find it a little distressing to find this mental jousting, this mental, emotional, social jousting from both sides that is very incomplete. Both sides are very incomplete and starting to hang on to agendas that aren't even serving people's own positions anymore, out of some kind of familiarity. And we're going to get to that in a moment, because we do cling to what's familiar when our world's falling apart on these conscious levels of
unconscious levels. Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So let's kind of back up in the story just a little bit. I've jumped forward. We're going to pick it up. It's kind of a tease, you might say, I guess, inadvertently. Now, we were talking about this whole notion of the understanding of the plumed serpent, as you call it, which is the sine wave of consciousness and of creation. But the Judeo-Christian cultures were the ones that never bought into it. What is the implication or ramification of our kind of dominant Western world religions and cultures having not bought into this larger, longer understanding of cycles and waves of consciousness?
Yeah, it's tremendously consequential at this time, and it hasn't really been consequential as we have been aware anyway. And, you know, in ancient times, people all over the world basically believed in this serpent, or as in China, the serpentine dragons, and in Amazonas, the tribes, they believed that it was the great anaconda that created the humans, and among the Maya or the Mexicans in Aztecs, it was the plumed serpent. And so it's hard to believe that this was just be some kind of a fantasy that they had.
And in Asian cultures and religions as well.
Yeah. But what comes up now is really that this, you know, we've all probably read this story in Genesis of Yahweh, the Jewish God that later became the Christian God, how he has this standoff with the serpent, really, and it curses the serpent, and that's then what became some kind of a religious fundament for Western civilization. And you know, the problem with the serpent, and I can understand to some extent why this was, is that it goes up and down. And ancient times, people said it's yin and yang, it's shifting, and what comes up must come down, and so forth. But then through this making, you know, if I would interpret it, basically they created a god in their own image, a human god, kind of, who says, rejects the serpent and that idea of evolution being driven by waves. Then it really fostered a belief in an enormous power of the human individual, even at the expense of the actual processes that drive the evolution of nature in its entirety.
That makes sense, because it would provide a certainty. If you worship and obey me, I can keep order in your world. When in fact, no being of any kind has control over the order of waves of consciousness and rise and fall of consciousness.
Exactly, yeah. And so So I would say, because that's part of what is happening now, that because of this rejection of the serpent that was, among the Christians even became qualified as the devil or something like that. The serpent was a real bad thing. Because of that, it's very hard for us to realize, to accept that maybe there is a downturn, at least on one level of consciousness, and we expect everything to go sort of linearly forward without considering how the universe has actually been evolving through wave-like movements. And of course, people have wondered about why did this culture disappear, why did the Maya disappear, and these kind of things. And they would have said, because the plumed serpent abandoned us, and we have text from the Maya that says exactly that. That's how they perceived it. But we can't, we have a hard time with this aspect of reality.
Indeed, because we have no control over it. But we
Right.
do have a choice as to how we're going to participate and evolve collectively and individually within it. And that's really the key part that we're going to be slamming into. We already are slamming into, but as the world starts waking back up again and looking around and seeing what's happened, it's going to require a huge amount of emotional and mental maturity and adjustment to move into the more beautiful aspect of this. So let's go back into this. So in the Mayan tradition, Quetzalcoatl was seen as the daytime. It was seen at the top of the wave, where certain civilizations, which we'll get into in a moment, were seen at their peak, rising to their peak. And I cannot pronounce the name of the nighttime complement of Quetzalcoatl, so will you please say it for us?
Tezcatlipoca.
That's why I can't say it.
That's right.
So, say it again.
Tezcatlipoca.
Tezcatlipoca. Okay.
Or the smoking mirror, if you would translate to English. Yeah.
This is the being of the night, which is what happens when we go down in the wave pattern in consciousness. And so let's take a look at this processing unit. Okay, first of all, our mind, the way you describe it in here is exactly the way I see it. This is a processing unit, which is going to be literally interfacing with the waves of consciousness that we're bathed within. Okay, so this processing unit has a chance to tap in on any of these waves as it is capable of, or as it intends to do, right?
Yes.
So let's go back now and look at what happened more historically before we get to today. And that has to do with civilizations. I was looking at this particular wave here that talks about the rise and fall. Everybody can see this graph here of certain civilizations. And we have the Old Kingdom in Egypt, for example. So maybe you want to go ahead and riff for a moment on the high times of what the Old Kingdom in Egypt had to offer.
Well, that's the time when the pharaonic Egypt was really founded, when it became a nation under one pharaoh. And, they symbolized that formation by the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And they looked upon it as a creation by the gods. I think that's very important to think of. They didn't say that, oh, this pharaoh created it. No, the pharaoh downloaded the Horus symbol and became divine, and that's how they created it. And then that became the beginning of this fantastic Egyptian civilization. And at that time, they started to build pyramids and cities and developed calendars, started to use numerals, started writing, and all of those things make sense if you look upon it as a quantum shift that changed the minds of people in such a way that they got completely new capabilities. And that's the birth of civilization, really, that particular point in time, I would say.
I hope you're enjoying this video, because if you are, there are dozens more like it on my site, all supported by people like you. So if you'd like to keep this work rolling in and join our community, just click on the Patreon button at reginameredith.com. That also gives you access to insider commentary, my live book club, and other live events with special guests. So join in. Thanks.
Yes, and there was a continuation on that theme, really more to go back and recapture and preserve it, that happened again, as we can see on this graph. If we look at the Middle Kingdom, or the dynasty that really peaked in the time of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, for example, which is a very controversial period of history, some feel fraught with this kind of behavior we're seeing today, conspiracy and the like, where at the same time you had an individual that was trying to uphold the very highest levels of cosmic consciousness, which did become a threat to the people. But you see, that's right at the very top, that 1350 AD, very top at that particular wave. How did you see that characterized?
Well, this first peak was then only the beginning of the civilization, and Egypt was, is one of the most long-lasting of civilizations on our planet. And you might say it took until the midpoint of this whole wave in 550 until the Persians came and conquered Egypt, and then was taken over by Alexander. It became Greece or something like that.
Right.
It's an amazingly long trajectory of 2,500 years, but it had its ups and downs, and I'm not quite qualified to talk about all of these intermediate periods and etc. etc. But yes, there was the New Kingdom, and when it suddenly flourished once again and became something much more close to our own time, I would say, or compared to the earliest, it's still a tremendous mystery, the whole thing of building the big pyramids and so forth. We cannot fathom that, no matter what, so to speak. Yeah. But then later, we can grasp more of it. And Cleopatra, she was the last of the pharaohs. And we read maybe about her story and so forth, and think, that's kind of something I can relate to myself as happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then we go to, we look at the Roman Empire, which we're looking at really a very high time around 200 AD, the beginning in 200 AD, and then starting to fall back down at 200. And you'll see that it starts becoming, Constantine came in, it was essentially overtaken by Christianity and on its descendant, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Because it appeared that Christianity was born on a descending pattern.
That's a good point. Yeah, certainly it became dominating in the Roman Empire on that downfall, so to speak. Yes.
Yeah, I was just noticing that, and I was just looking at dates and putting things together. I thought, that's interesting.
It is, and you might say Christianity initiates the Dark Ages. That came after.
Yes, and many would say that was the case. There was such brutality that followed that. And now I want to hop forward. Okay, so one thing you state in here is that while these waves may come to an end numerically, it doesn't mean that the population that's been steeped in it ceases to exist. So the populations continue on and either can be absolutely shattered at having to let go of the known, or there is a kind of maturity and grace that happens that allows them to continue taking this on and forward into higher understandings. Can you give us any examples of where a population continued on?
Well, I would say that most clear example would probably be the medieval Europe. So when this peak starts, the sixth peak of the seven major peaks there, the sixth peak then, that's kind of when what's called the Holy Roman Empire was founded. It really was centered in Germany, and it was a German Otto I who became the first emperor of this particular empire. But then when that comes to an end, which happens 1223 AD, there's not a complete destruction. It's just what we would call more or less a preparation going on for the next expression of European power that comes in the final and seventh. So it's not a complete, but it's hard times. And whether we have read about the Black Death, that's part of that particular downturn. But they still build big cathedrals, if that's any impressive, if nothing else, in that particular time, that particular era of that night, so to speak.
And this is what you just read up is important, because you have stated that oftentimes very large pandemic cycles do occur when we're on the descendant in these periods. Historically, what other patterns have you seen in terms of pandemics? And then an anomaly seems to be kind of the Spanish flu. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, well point. Yes, absolutely. That's a good point. So an anomaly is the Spanish flu, but I think the biggest ones, the biggest pandemics, and then we're talking about real pandemics where like the Black Death in Europe, that maybe 30-50% of the population would pass away. There was also a very significant called the Justinian death that was in the East Roman Empire in 541 AD. And that's something like that, 50% or something like that. And then not to forget the enormous pandemics that the Native American populations became the victims of.
Yes.
Especially in Mexico and North America and wherever Europeans came. And mostly, well, we don't really know, but mostly these were smallpoxes and so forth. And that's huge proportions of the populations that would succumb to those particular things. And all of these came to be in dark periods, in downturns, so to speak. But, history is also full of exceptions. It's not an easy straight line. And one of those would be the Spanish flu in 1918 after the World War I.
Yeah, I just brought that in because you don't see that indicated in that kind of sine wave. And so now we get to the rise of the British and American empires. Okay.
Yes.
And let's look at that toward the end of this graph, as we can see. And we can see where we are right now, which is more than past that halfway line on the decline.
Yes.
Let's talk about how that shows itself. Combine a potential pandemic in it, and let's get to where we are right now.
Yeah. Well, so it's fairly clear that, the last of these seven peaks, it starts with the time when the British Empire becomes. There was something called the unification of the crowns that unified Scotland, England, and Ireland at that time, which was in 1603. And then that's when they started to found their first colonies. It would be one place in India in 1615, and then after Jamestown in Virginia came the Plymouth Bay in Massachusetts in 1620, and then from that point on, for almost 400 years, that became the starting point of a Western dominance of the world. And today, you know, most people that grew up today think maybe that's something that's normal and always been like that, but it certainly wasn't like that before this final peak came about. And now we are, that whole period has changed. And it is like, you know, if you look upon our minds as being created by resonance with these kind of waves that we're downloading from the cosmic center, there was a shift in that in 2011. So the quantum state within which, the state of consciousness within which we understand reality, changed that. Not like overnight, it's a long period. We're talking about Baktuns, as you mentioned, which are almost 400 years. But it's a beginning of a shift. And that has changed the mindset of people, you know, maybe most markedly in exactly the Western, dominating Western powers in the United States and the UK. And but of course, what that particular the civilization created by British Empire and the American follow-up to it, created was a global civilization for the first time in human history, you might say. And so what this means is that even though I would say that the Asian countries today are much more stable than politically speaking than the Western, we're all in it together in a certain sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because that age that was given birth to, that gave rise to the British Empire and then the expansion of America, the rise of America, also brought in industrialization, scientific materialism to the max. Now we're moving into colonialism, okay? And it's not the first time the colonialism has appeared, but everything was based upon it. And also now we've become not just a bureaucracy, a technocracy. And so we're talking about really the dominance of the left brain in the rise of these cultures, and the type of consciousness that feeds rational thinking and moves away from the more intuitive, organic processes of mind, which is what the native people around the planet, Aboriginal peoples around the planet, had always relied on, a combination of the two. And we literally threw away functionally speaking, the creative right brain functioning to be able to serve the master we created in these civilizations.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a big, in a sense, that's why the indigenous peoples were often conquered. But it's another aspect also. It is, as you're saying, this sort of rational, analytical left brain mindset that came with this particular quantum state. But it's the thing about that is that it also is a quantum state of duality. In other words, the left brain half dominates the right brain half. And that duality has created a world where some dominate the others. I mean, this is not new. 400 years ago, the whole 5,000 years of human history is basically based on that quantum state of duality, where the left brain half dominates the right brain half. And this has had enormous consequences. And that's really what you would call a patriarchal civilization. That's what it's about. And then what that means is that throughout these time periods. The negative aspects of it, the positive aspects of it is that there is an analytical ability that allows people to, create the inventions and all that kind of stuff. The negative aspect of it is that if we're downloading that kind of a duality, where the light is on the left brain half, the darkness is on the right brain half, then we will project that duality onto ourselves, but also, most importantly, on other people and on nature. In other words, we will think that systems of governance that are based on dominance are natural, which wasn't the case before, and it's not part of the indigenous peoples of the planet, essentially. I don't know, I mean, it's changed. Everybody has to some extent incorporated this kind of a perception of the world. But then it becomes, if you walk around without knowing yourself, in a quantum state with a duality of mind, it means you will project, these are the good ones and those are the bad ones. The bad ones are the ones you see through the dark field of your perception. And it also creates this whole, you may actually look upon yourself through that kind of duality, which fosters a kind of a judgmental attitude towards yourself and to nature. It's like, yes, we are here to dominate nature. And I'm not saying that this doesn't have a place. It had a place because that's where civilization has taken us. But we should absolutely be aware of the downside of this particular quantum state of looking through reality.
Yes, and now we get back to what I spoke to and touched on earlier, which has to do with when you're on a descending pattern. In this case, we're on a descending pattern that's had to do with duality, scientific materialism, colonialism, industrialization, all the things we've really come to detest on a personal level, oftentimes as human beings. These are things that served us in terms of being able to get our stuff mailed to us, from Amazon, but these aren't things that have served the soul that well. And many people watching this have already recognized that we're at that place. But what's happening alongside it is this phenomena you spoke about in the article, where now anxiety. You can see that you're not getting the whole story. You can feel that you're not tapping into the whole truth. And we're on a descending plane of consciousness, which starts fostering suspicion, fear, and these things start giving rise to the notion of conspiracy. And because we're so entrenched in conspiracy right now, you have one channel over here saying this, another channel over here saying this. You have Russian operatives pretending to be American and British information sources saying this, and everybody hopping onto their little piece of the pie and holding on to a sense of self-righteousness that their part is right. And so let's talk about what has given rise to that, because it's fascinating to watch.
It is, and it's so much happening right now, or it's becoming so evident right now. And so even though it's one way, but we already talked about Quetzalcoatl being the quantum state of their symbol of the quantum state of the peak, and Tezcatlipoca being their symbol of the quantum state of the valley. It still was a shift in the dominating quantum state from Quetzalcoatl to Tezcatlipoca in the year 2011. And that has had enormous consequences because, you and I, we grow up entirely within the Quetzalcoatl quantum state and thought, well, we based on that, we said, well, I'm a left wing, or I'm right wing, or I believe in this or that, and things were sort of within a fairly narrow framework, even if there were dissonances or divergences in how we looked. But then came this and here it comes back to this fact that we don't have that worldview where we can imagine that history goes up and down. So people are not even aware that that there was a shift in consciousness happening in 2011. And for that reason, but they sense it. They sense it. Something here is influencing me. Something here is controlling me. I don't know what it is, but just because we've gone through that kind of a shift, we do become aware that we've gone through something outside ourselves are controlling us. And there is a truth to that, except that it's much better if you know that has happened, because then you will maybe be able to regain your compass and feel what is the best way of dealing with this particular situation. So from that feeling, and it might even be, fearful, the fact that there is something actually in the cosmos center that controls how I perceive reality. If you're a big ego, that will really take you to accept something like that. But to most people, it's easier to say, "Oh, it must be that mega controller somewhere that's creating this pandemic," and all kinds of conspiracy theories based on the idea that there are that history. It's almost like they believe that history is driven by what should we say, multi-oligarchs or something like that. And I'm not saying that there are not multi-oligarchs out there to take advantage of the situation.
Well, certainly there are, yes.
You bet. we know that. But that doesn't mean that they drive the evolution of history.
Exactly.
They're just fitting into what we are unconscious of.
Yes, I mean, that's perfectly put. And here, as you hear all of the debate going on, is this, do we have, from people saying it's a fake virus, there's no virus at all, to people saying, yeah, there's a virus, but it's not real because it's not natural because it escaped from a lab, to no, it's something that jumped from, a rat or a bat or something. Everybody's got their theories on it, of what it is. But one thing for sure, it has changed our way of life, whether it is, whether it isn't. Yes. It doesn't matter. And would you say, looking at this stage of consciousness that we're in, that this was essentially, this would have been a totally appropriate thing to happen, to stun everything, stun all the systems around the world at this time, to stop everything for a moment, for a pulse? Is there a place for that in this wave?
Well, I would say that I think quite a few people actually had some kind of a sense that something like this would happen.
Yeah, I did. I felt it very strongly. Mm-hmm.
I would think so too. And, the first thing that I did when I moved to New Mexico from Seattle was to, start to do a garden.
Yes.
And
you and me both.
So I expected that immediately, something much more earlier to have happened, like 2012 or something like that. And then it didn't.
Yes. I think that caught a lot of people by surprise.
Yeah.
There was a feeling that the time was already ripe for that. Yeah. And it didn't happen. And I think that itself created a kind of cognitive dissonance in those people who are sensitive and tuned in to the energies. Like, what stopped it? It appears there was a lot of manipulation at very many levels to stop this thing, because a way of life would start drawing to a close. Yeah. And it might have been that they printed a lot of money, and then they sort of artificially, I've talked to economists that could agree with that, but it was also something that
is actually a H-wave phenomenon, the emergence of the mega digital corporations, all of these that have sort of prolonged what otherwise probably would have been a downturn happening a couple of years. So I think a lot of people had the correct intuition, including myself, but I at that point I wasn't sure about when it would happen, and now it's happening. So what I'm saying through this is that it's not the thought that something like this would happen is not far-fetched.
No, not at all. And I think the primary thing, again, going back to consciousness, is how we're going to engage with it. It's been interesting because in our old way of life, which was 2 months ago.
Right. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. In the old way, you'd go out to a cafe and you'd see a family of people sitting there together on their iPhones. Everybody texting someone else, using any messages, totally disconnected while together physically. And now people are apart physically, but I have to say, I personally have never seen people take more time and effort to be connected with family and friends, even though now they're having to do it virtually for the moment, although that's changing by the moment, as we can see around the world. And so on a heart level, people started choosing to connect in a more meaningful way.
Yeah.
Technology, which is an interesting kind of confluence of the times. Technology taking us to deeper connection, which ideally it should be used for that. So the point now is you state in your book, and you state also in this amazing article that you sent to me, that this is all leading towards something, because you'd look at it and say, oh crap, how come I chose to incarnate on a down cycle? Well, first of all,
what advice did I have?
It's like, we've done it before. Okay, we've all died before. Okay, it's I mean, depending if you believe that way, but yeah, we've been through this before as a civilization, and likely each of us as individuals. So, okay. Things come, things go, we rise and fall. But you'd say, gosh, this is really looking kind of ugly. You know, what's the point to rise and fall? But it all is leading towards something that is a very beautiful possibility and has been very difficult to achieve here on Earth. And that is what you call really moving toward unity consciousness. And we have to remember, it's not the oligarchs with the power. It's each soul on this earth taking their own power through their own intention of what they're choosing to connect with and live into. So please explain to us what the possibility of the times is leading us to.
Yeah. So in a sense, you know, you have these, from ancient times, so you have these ideas that there are downturns. You know, that you have the god Shiva in India, who was both the creator and the destroyer. And he was destroying in order to create the space for something new to be created, basically. It wasn't just destroying for the fun of destructivity. And in a sense, then, you might say that, you know, the current quantum state that we are in on the 6th level. And if people think this is complicated, I understand that. That's why I write my books.
Right.
But still, I will talk about it as straight as I can. That on that level, it is an equalization taking place. You know, I talked about how this duality of the 6th wave, by humans projecting that, came to think that slavery was a natural thing because their mindset was completely dominated by that control, dominance, so forth. But now that has shifted into it's a dark age, yes, on that level, but it's an equally dark on both sides. And so there will be a suppression of forms of dominance that have dominated the planet for a long time. And then on top of this, there are other waves, the 7th wave, the 8th wave, and finally the 9th wave. And they all carry their own quantum states. And especially then the ninth wave is one where there is no veils. So there's no projection of darkness onto others or yourself, really. And that is the real, I'm convinced that that's really, to that state of consciousness is where humanity is meant to go. And but also that it won't happen automatically. And so I'm calling for anyone interested in this, or maybe feeling called to it, to work towards a new kind of spiritual path that is not just individual. In other words, it's not about each one of us having our individual paths. We will have to develop a we path for the future. And that won't happen automatically, I think. But I'm sure that the ninth wave holds that particular possibility. And that, from that perspective of looking at reality without any veils, it just means a completely different way of relating to others and to nature, and it would mean really a new beginning to attain that kind of a state as a permanent thing.
Absolutely. As it is, people so often talk about unity consciousness, but don't really take the time to delve into what that requires of us. And now it's actually required of us in a very clear and stark way. It's required of us.
Yeah.
Now it's going to look very different for each person. I see people who are living in fear. They're afraid to go out of their homes. They're afraid of potential vaccines that are going to be forced upon them or mandated, which is, I get that. But nonetheless, for all these different things, they're afraid that the person next to them in line is going to infect them, and literally living in fear and watching conspiracy stories all day long about who's out to get them. And that is one reality. And it is it's kind of, I think, an isolating, sad, and dark way to live. It's not how I choose to live. I mean, I think of today, I'm in California, and we're in an area that's not super dense in population, but nonetheless outside of Sacramento in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And so today I went to the gardening store and got some supplies, and Trader Joe's and Whole Foods, came home, gave my husband a haircut, wrote my script so that I could meet with you right now, and I have other meetings this afternoon. Life goes on. And it's not like I'm being careless. I'm doing my, being polite. I'm not sneezing on anyone. Social distancing. Everyone has to contend with this in the way I think their intuition is telling them. And so here people are being considerate. I wouldn't say overly cautious, but cautious. Life is moving on. Things are opening up. Freeway traffic is picking back up again at this point. Here we are doing this in early May 2020 when they haven't announced official openings, but people are opening up. They're starting to feel this. And so for me, I have already more than a dozen zucchini. They'll be ready to eat. The garden's growing. And it's actually another kind of beautiful springtime without fooling myself that on the external material world it's going to be very different beginning this summer and forward. So how can we do this together? That's the question. How do we share with one another? I mean, we're already starting to do that. One person goes to the store for 2 or 3 other people. The other one makes a run another day. Someone bakes, and shares with someone else. And it's so much, to me, so much more beautiful, organic way of living than what we've been doing. I don't know. How do you feel about the time for you?
Well, I saw some Facebook page called The Kindness Pandemic.
Yes, I saw that. I love it.
Oh, yes. And there is something to that. things have slowed down, and that's exactly what you would expect from a downturn in these waves. I've been saying that for 20 years.
Yes.
That's what's happening. Things are literally slowing down, and it does allow for us to express kindness in a way that we normally wouldn't be doing, in that if we were forced forward by the peak state, so to speak, where people are much more active and forward moving, and so forth. So that is that's really a possibility for everyone always. It's just that normally we have not been thinking about kindness even.
Right.
Of it, and that's really, it comes a very long way. I'm for the moment I'm working with preparing an event, or a digital event, together with Patricia Albere, whom I think is one who has developed a we path, so to speak, rather than a me path. And
yes.
We'll have that on June 6th. And so I'm doing like this and these kind of things. It's I'm a little bit bored, I must admit that, but that's what happens.
Well, that's what happens when things slow down unexpectedly. In fact, grind to a halt.
Yeah, I'm not the only one.
You're not the only one. I think most people are experiencing that. And, the other thing you're talking about, kindness, what this time is going to require is generosity.
Yeah.
I'm living in a place where I have a little garden and I'm pretty safe. There are people living in places that aren't safe, that don't have food supplies and don't have money and don't have food right now.
Yeah.
That is genuine suffering. And so it is going to take, we can't look to these patriarchal institutions that have dominated for so long that we literally need to allow to commit suicide. The system has to commit suicide, so to speak. Just let it run its course. It isn't going to be there for us for the most part. It's already proven that. It's only fed itself. It's continued to serve the patriarchy and the wealthiest in the world. So that's not there, meaning who's going to do it? We have to do it for one another.
Said.
We have to be generous and kind and help one another now. And we haven't had to do that for a long time, probably not since a wartime or something. Yeah. So, to me, I see this as a chance really for us to start bringing about much higher virtues in ourselves than we've been digging into for quite a long time. And there's so much more to this conversation. I have to say, Carl, Barbara Hanklau is a good friend of mine. We see each other now and then, and she just has always had such incredibly complimentary things to say about you. And I appreciate, as the years go on now, really what times you were born for. You were born for right now. And and the way I see it is, I created a graphic for this, which we can put up here and you can take a look at. And in this graphic, it's flipping that pyramid that David Icke and so many other people have talked about for years. The pyramid with the 1% at the top, ruling many. I'm saying no. I'm done with that pyramid. We have to invert the pyramid. All of the beauty of humanity is at the top, and down at the bottom is the pathetic, kind of dying, patriarchal 1% and system that is literally crumbling before our eyes. Even if the perception is it has control over us, it's dying. I think we have to keep that in mind.
Wonderfully said.
Yeah. So we have to give birth to the new thing. And I love it. Tell us a little bit more about your event, and tell us the best way to check in with you and the event in terms of websites, etc.
Yeah, okay. So we haven't really, it's coming 6th of June. It's about finding unity through the ninth wave. And so it's really sort of a practical thing about getting into that state of consciousness, not just like I mostly do talk about it. And but then my webpage is calleman.com, CALLEMAN.com, and I also have a couple of Facebook pages, but there you can also find a calculator there from which you can follow the ninth wave, and you can find my books, which are also on Amazon and everywhere else where you buy books.
That sounds good. Well, we're going to pick this conversation up because we've dipped in to a certain extent, but we're going to go even deeper into some of this phenomena in my next conversation with you that will happen at Gaia and will be seen later on this summer. I think the producer's still trying to get hold of you to arrange the exact date. So okay. I'll very much look forward to seeing you in person again, Carl. And until then, good luck on your June 6th event. Thank you for taking the time. And I'm just so grateful that you've done this work to put a higher perspective to all of it, because that is the calming influence, as far as I'm concerned, is to know it's not for naught. We're not suffering needlessly.
Okay. Thank you so much, Regina. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Again, everybody, you can go to Calleman.com, and then we're talking about 9 Waves of Creation as the book that's really relevant to what's happening right now, and that we'll be continuing our conversation on, again, a little later on this summer. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us here at ReginaMeredith.com.